The diary of my ex-wife. A shocking revelation. After divorcing Grace, my ex-wife, I married Victoria, the love of my life from 10 years ago. The house and custody of Tommy, my son, were awarded to me, while Grace left with nothing. While sorting through Grace's belongings, I stumbled upon her diary. Its pages were filled with her anguish and heartache. Asterisk. I had a 104-degree fever today. Called Marcus, but he said Victoria sprained her ankle and told me not to act pathetic in front of him. Asterisk. Asterisk. Got into a car accident and hoped Marcus would take me to the hospital. As expected, he didn't believe me. He cursed me and told me to die just so he could attend Victoria's birthday party. Asterisk. Asterisk. Dad was gravely ill and passed away. I tried calling Marcus, but he didn't answer. Turns out he was with Victoria, helping her prepare for a job interview. Asterisk. Asterisk. I'm so tired. I don't think I can hold on anymore. Asterisk. The more I read, the more irritable I became. Sure, I've been neglectful these past couple of years. But isn't that how men are? Why hold such grudges? Then I flipped to the last page, and what I saw made me spiral into a pit of guilt. Grace and I reconnected at a college reunion. Victoria had just moved abroad, and Grace seized the opportunity, ending up in my bed. She wasn't much to look at, and her education was average at best. Everyone said she wasn't good enough for me. Still, I took on the responsibility of being her husband. For years, I worked hard to provide for the family. I rarely drank excessively, and I never cheated on her. I thought I'd done my part. Yet her diary was filled with grievances. So many complaints. Even forgetting to buy her an anniversary gift made the list. We were practically an old married couple. Wasn't this sort of thing normal? Thankfully, the divorce was finalized. Victoria would never blow things out of proportion like Grace did. I grew increasingly annoyed as I read, ready to toss the diary aside, until I came across the entry about her fever. Asterisk. 104-degree fever today. Felt like I was dying. Asterisk. Asterisk. Called Marcus, but he said Victoria sprained her ankle and needed his care. Told me not to act pathetic. Asterisk. Asterisk. But I wasn't acting. I really wasn't. For heaven's sake, I'm his wife. Asterisk. I tried to recall that day. It did ring a bell. Victoria had indeed called, saying she sprained her ankle while going down the stairs. She was an old friend after all. Helping her out wasn't a big deal, right? Grace called shortly after, claiming she had a high fever. 104 degrees, she said. What were the odds? She had always been petty, so naturally, I thought she was just trying to keep me away from Victoria. I remembered snapping at her over the phone. Grace, can you stop making a fuss? You knew Victoria sprained her ankle, and you conveniently get sick today? Stop pretending to be miserable. If you're sick, go see a doctor. I hung up on her and went with Victoria to her doctor's appointment instead. The next day when I returned home, Grace gave me the cold shoulder. She didn't even prepare breakfast. Honestly, we're adults. A fever isn't a big deal. But after that day, she seemed to change. She stopped calling me over minor scrapes or colds. Once, I brought her some cold medicine and she brushed me off. You're so busy with work. Don't worry about me. I can take care of myself. Sometimes I wondered if I really wasn't attentive enough to her. But then again, she always made a big deal out of things, nitpicking over every little detail. As I continued reading, I reached the entry about her car accident. That day was Victoria's 30th birthday. I remembered it vividly. I'd spent weeks planning, ordering a custom diamond ring to surprise her. It wasn't romantic, though. I was just keeping a promise I'd made to her 10 years ago. Grace described the incident in her diary. Asterisk. What bad luck. Got into a car accident. My leg felt like it was crushed. Asterisk. Asterisk. Called Marcus, hoping he'd take me to the hospital. As expected, he didn't believe me. He thought I was faking it. Asterisk. Asterisk. He cursed at me, told me to go die, just so he could celebrate Victoria's birthday. Does he hate me that much? Asterisk. Her handwriting conveyed her heartbreak and despair. But honestly, I didn't think I was at fault. When she called, I was just handing the ring to Victoria. Friends around us were cheering and clapping. The mood was so festive, and she had to call and ruin it with talk of a car accident. Victoria, ever so understanding, even urged me to leave. If Grace is calling, it must be something urgent. Of course, I'd love for you to stay, but I understand if you need to go. Grace is your wife after all. Don't worry about me. I won't hold it against you. How could I let her down? She was such a wonderful woman. Grace, on the other hand, was so inconsiderate, going on about how she felt like she was dying. It was Victoria's birthday. Why bring up something so morbid? I lost my temper and yelled, "Stop with the dying nonsense. If you want to die so badly, then go die. Just leave me alone, will you?" She hung up immediately, probably scared by my outburst. I remember that when I came home the next day, Grace was wrapped in bandages all over her body, leaning on a crutch. When I asked what had happened, she didn't say a word. She just looked at me with a strange expression on her face. To ease the tension, I tried to make a joke. "What's going on? Don't tell me you were really in a car accident? You know I was busy at the time. So how did you get through it? Who took you to the hospital? Wrapped up like this, are the injuries serious? Is there anything I can do to help?" I can still remember the look in Grace's eyes at that moment. Sadness, disappointment, and a profound sense of helplessness. This time she didn't lose her temper. Instead, she silently went into the kitchen and started preparing breakfast for me. "I'm fine. I just need a couple of days to rest," she said softly. From the way she acted, I really thought it wasn't a big deal. But later I found her diary. It described what had happened in such painful detail. Asterisk, to save my life, I dragged my body out of the car. There was a huge gash on my leg. Asterisk. Asterisk, but I couldn't cry. After all, I'm not Victoria. Even if I cried, no one would care. Asterisk. Asterisk, the doctor said I came too late. I'd already missed the best window for treatment. It might leave me permanently disabled. Asterisk. Asterisk, it's fine. From now on, I won't expect anything from anyone anymore. Asterisk. What kind of despair could lead someone to write words like these? I couldn't help but sink into my thoughts. It seemed that even up until our divorce, Grace's leg never fully recovered. But I'd never once cared enough to ask about it. Could it really have been my fault? As I thought about it, I couldn't help but shake my head. No, I told myself it wasn't entirely my fault. She was just being too sensitive. After all, I did ask her if she needed help later on. But every time she said no. She even insisted on taking a cab to the hospital by herself to get her dressings changed. If she didn't tell me her leg was hurt, how was I supposed to know? I'm not a mind reader. If she had just come to me and said something, would I really have ignored her? Thinking this way helped me feel a little better. At some point, Tommy ran out of his room and saw the diary in my hands. He angrily knocked it to the floor. "Dad, why are you still keeping that woman's stuff?" he shouted. "What if Mom Victoria sees it? You've got to have some boundaries as a man. If you keep thinking about that ugly woman, I'm not going to like you anymore." Hearing my son say this, I felt an inexplicable surge of anger. When did Tommy start hating Grace so much? Could it be that my parenting was flawed? Grace had always worked so hard for us, never complaining, never making a fuss. She didn't deserve this kind of resentment from her own son. I couldn't help but tap Tommy lightly on the head. "What do you mean by that woman? No matter what, she's still your mother." Tommy covered his head and started crying, then ran off to find Victoria. As he left, he muttered under his breath, "Bad Dad. You're just as bad as that ugly woman." I only want Victoria as my mom. That woman is mean and ugly. She doesn't deserve to be my mom. I thought to myself, maybe Grace had been too strict with him. She wouldn't let him eat snacks, wouldn't let him play video games, and always made him eat vegetables and study harder. Victoria, on the other hand, never imposed any restrictions on him. It's no wonder Tommy liked her so much. Honestly, Tommy wasn't entirely wrong. As a man, I should naturally keep my distance from my ex-wife. There's no point dwelling on those trivial arguments from the past. It's all in the past now, and it wasn't entirely my fault. Grace was the one who asked for the divorce after all. It's not as if I cheated. What do I have to feel guilty about? With that thought, I was about to close the diary. But when I saw Tommy throwing himself into Victoria's arms, snuggling up to her, I couldn't help but feel a pang of emptiness in my chest. Once upon a time, the three of us, Grace, Tommy, and I, had been just as happy. When had things started to go so wrong between Grace and me? I thought back and realized it must have been about a year ago. Right then, the wind flipped the pages of the diary on the floor, landing on that entry. But what was written there was entirely different from how I remembered things. I remembered that day clearly. Victoria suddenly told me she had an interview for a job. But she just returned to the country and wasn't familiar with the industry here. She was nervous. As a friend, it wasn't inappropriate for me to drive her there, was it? But for some reason, Grace called me 10 times in a row that day. Victoria, ever considerate, kept reassuring me. If your wife is upset, you should go to her. Spend more time with her. This is my fault. We're just regular friends after all. I'll go by myself. I'm a bit scared, but it's fine. But as a man, how could I let a woman face something like that alone? Besides, Grace had always said she could take care of herself. So why was she calling me so many times now? It had to be because she knew I was with Victoria and was deliberately stirring up trouble. I wasn't cheating. I wasn't doing anything wrong. The thought of her being so petty made me mute my phone altogether. After the 10th call finally went unanswered, I was relieved. I had successfully accompanied Victoria to her interview. I thought about returning Grace's call to ask what she needed, but Victoria insisted on thanking me with a meal. One thing led to another, and I completely forgot about it. Probably wasn't anything important anyway. If it were, she would have called again, at least that's what I told myself. With that mindset, I stumbled home drunk. Grace was sitting silently on the couch, her eyes swollen from crying. In a hoarse voice, she confronted me. Where were you today? Why didn't you answer my calls? Do you even know what today is? Do you know what happened? I felt a twinge of guilt at first, but her yelling triggered my temper. What day? Are we back to your anniversaries or birthdays? Can you stop making such a fuss over trivial things? I'm out here working my ass off to support this family. Isn't that enough for you? Yes, I was with Victoria at her interview. So what? Do you have a problem with that? Grace's whole body trembled with anger. I thought she was finally going to explode, but she didn't. Instead, she just shook her head with a bitter smile, wiping her tears away. It's nothing. Nothing at all. Let's just leave it at that. With that, she turned and went upstairs, her voice carrying a deep sense of resignation. I knew in my heart that something important must have happened, but I was too stubborn to ask. From that day forward, Grace never called me again. Not a single text. Outside of matters involving Tommy, we no longer communicated. It was as if she had completely lost all hope. At the time, I didn't understand. I even gave her the silent treatment, thinking she was being petty over something so small. But when I read her diary, my heart skipped a beat. Today is the day my father passed away. The one person in this world who loved me the most is gone forever. I called Marcus, but of course he didn't pick up. Turns out he was accompanying Victoria to an interview. Even on his deathbed, Dad's only wish was for me to be happy. But can I really be happy? I'm so tired. I don't know how much longer I can keep going. Henry had passed away, and I had no idea such a monumental event had even occurred. So during that time, she had been mourning the loss of her father. She faced the death of her closest family member alone. And I, her husband, not only failed to offer her any comfort but also ignored her calls 10 times in a row. How hopeless must she have felt? The thought alone made me want to slap myself. Why couldn't I have just asked her what was wrong? Why couldn't I have shown her a little more care? I had always been so patient and considerate when it came to Victoria. Even my colleagues at work praised me as a model husband. Yet when it came to Grace, I instinctively dismissed her. I took all her goodness for granted. I was despicable. While I was drowning in guilt, Tommy's panic screams pulled me back to reality. Dad, something's wrong. Victoria's passed out. Stop reading that stupid diary and take her to the hospital. Seeing Victoria's pale face as she collapsed, I panicked. I threw the diary aside and carried her in my arms. But as I rushed to get her into the car, Grace flashed through my mind. Back when Grace was in a car accident, had she needed me as much as Victoria did now? Maybe I'd been too biased, too blind to see her pain. Marcus, I feel so awful. Victoria's voice, trembling with tears, snapped me out of my thoughts. My heart melted instantly. Victoria was my wife now. How could I even think about comparing the two of them? Grace had grown up poor and resilient, tough enough to handle her own problems. But Victoria was different. She had always been frail, her health so delicate that even years of treatment abroad hadn't fully healed her. It was only natural for me to care more about Victoria, wasn't it? Thinking this way was the only way I could ease my guilt. I told myself that from now on the three of us, Victoria, Tommy, and I, would just live a peaceful life together. No more dwelling on the past. But the doctor's diagnosis shattered that illusion in an instant. Mrs. Cheen has leukemia. It's already in an advanced stage. Her body was weak to begin with. It seems she experienced some kind of severe trauma recently. If she doesn't get a bone marrow transplant soon, things could become very dangerous. Severe trauma? If I had to pinpoint something, it would be that incident. Half a year ago, Victoria had been pushed into the water by Grace. That was the same event that led Grace to ask me for a divorce. Hearing how serious Victoria's condition was, Tommy was frantic. Gripping my hand tightly, he pleaded, "Dad, please save Victoria. I don't want her to die. I don't want her to die." But leukemia, how could I possibly save her? The only way forward was to start with a bone marrow match test. But when the results came back, it turned out that neither Victoria nor I were a match. Typically, a close blood relative is the best candidate for a transplant. The thing is, Victoria's parents had passed away years ago. Her relatives and friends, upon hearing about the need for a bone marrow transplant, were quick to avoid any involvement. Left with no other choice, I decided to take a gamble and had Tommy tested. To my surprise, his results came back as a perfect match. But he's still so young. There's no way I could let him take on such a risk. Yet I couldn't just stand by and do nothing while Victoria's life hung in the balance. After days of agonizing over the decision, an idea struck me. If Tommy's bone marrow was compatible, didn't that mean Grace's bone marrow might be as well? After all, it was Grace who had pushed Victoria into the water, causing her illness to resurface. Would it really be too much to ask her to take responsibility by donating her bone marrow to save Victoria? That sounded reasonable enough, but deep down I felt a twinge of guilt. After everything I'd done to Grace, how could I justify this? Just then, Tommy stormed in, his little face full of determination. "Dad, let's go find that bad woman. She's the reason Victoria Mommy is sick, isn't she? She has to pay for what she did. She should use her life to save Victoria Mommy." Hearing my son say this left me feeling deeply uncomfortable. Grace had endured a traumatic childbirth to bring him into this world, and had treated him as her everything. And yet, Here he was showing no compassion for her, as if he couldn't care less about her life. Thankfully, Victoria was a kind and gentle soul. Even as she battled her illness, she still couldn't bring herself to harm anyone. "Marcus, no. Please don't go looking for Grace," she said weakly, her voice trembling but resolute. "Even though she hurt me so much in the past, I don't blame her at all. I just want to spend a few more years with you and Tommy. But I know this disease won't wait. It's okay. I'll be okay. Just promise me you won't trouble her, okay?" Victoria's words were cut short by a violent coughing fit. Even at death's door, she was so understanding, so selfless. How could I bear to watch her suffer like this? After consulting with the doctor, I learned that a bone marrow donation is a relatively safe procedure and wouldn't cause lasting harm to the donor. Grace was always in good health. Surely donating bone marrow wouldn't be too much for her, right? With that in mind, I called Grace. "Hey, we need to meet." It had been a month since I last saw her. I'd expected her to look worn out, but the reality was far from what I imagined. Grace walked toward me in a sharp outfit, her heels clicking confidently against the pavement. Though her step still carried a slight limp, it did nothing to diminish the aura of self-assurance she exuded. I hadn't anticipated this transformation. In just a short time, she had gone from a stay-at-home mom to a corporate powerhouse. Then again, before she met me, she had already been excelling in her career. I was the one who'd asked her to quit her job to take care of Tommy, citing the need for a full-time parent at home. Still, wasn't it a woman's natural role to care for her family? Why the need to chase some high-powered career? "What do you want?" Grace's gaze was cold and detached, as though she were looking at a stranger. Her indifference rubbed me the wrong way. After all, we had been married for 10 years. How could she act like those years meant nothing, as if I were the one who had wronged her? My eyes inadvertently drifted to the scar on her leg, still glaringly obvious. That must have been from the car accident. When I thought about that, along with the time she had fallen ill and the funeral incident, guilt began to creep in. If I were being honest, I hadn't exactly been fair to her. So I softened my tone. "When I was cleaning out your room, I came across your journal. I read everything you wrote in it. As a man, I owe you an apology." With that, I gave her a deep bow. But Grace remained unmoved, her expression cold and unyielding. "And? If that's all, I'm leaving." She grabbed her bag and turned to walk away without a second thought. Tommy, quick as ever, stepped in to block her path, his little fists pounding against her. "Bad woman. You're not going anywhere. You can't leave. Victoria Mommy is sick, and you have to save her. You're responsible." Grace froze in her tracks, turning to me with a look of disbelief. "You came to me for Victoria?" Feeling a bit awkward, I rubbed the back of my neck and admitted, "Victoria has leukemia and needs a bone marrow transplant. Her condition had been under control, but the doctors say her relapse was caused by severe trauma. Half a year ago, you were the one who pushed her into the water, weren't you? You bear some responsibility, don't you? So, could you donate your bone marrow to save her?" I hadn't even finished speaking when Grace cut me off with ice-cold finality. "No, I won't save her. Everything that's happening to her now, she brought it on herself. She deserves all of it. I won't donate my bone marrow. If someone wants to save her, it won't be me." Her callousness took me aback, and I couldn't help but feel a surge of anger. "Grace, do you even have a shred of humanity left? I admit there were things I did wrong before, and I've apologized to you for them. But Victoria is innocent. You pushed her out of jealousy. Shouldn't you take responsibility for that? If you're willing to save her, I'm ready to remarry you. Will that do?" I grabbed her hand, speaking with a tone that bordered on condescension. Grace had lashed out at Victoria because she cared about me too much. Since everything started because of me, it was only fair that I ended it. If saving Victoria meant remarrying Grace, so be it. It wasn't a big deal. I thought she'd agree without hesitation. After all, she had been in the wrong. This was her chance to make amends and get something out of it. She used to care so much about me and Tommy. How could she not be tempted? But Grace remained silent for a long time before suddenly laughing. Remarry you? Are you joking? What makes you think I'd still want to marry you again? Being with you nearly cost me my life. Please, I'm begging you. Let me go. Her words stung. I slammed the table, feeling my dignity shred into pieces. Enough, Grace. Haven't you had enough? Let me give you some advice. Know when to quit while you're ahead. Don't push your luck. And if you're still hung up about what you read in the diary, I can promise you, nothing like that will ever happen again. Is that good enough for you? But clearly Grace wasn't satisfied. She gave me a strange look, then glanced at Tommy, who was glaring at her like she was his worst enemy. Her tone was still icy cold. I'm not going to save her. I can't save her. My health isn't good enough for a bone marrow transplant. Don't come to me again. Seeing her like this made my anger boil over. Grace, do you have to be so heartless? What are you even pretending for? You look perfectly healthy to me. You just don't want to save her. Grace had been calm up until now. But the moment I said the word pretending, her composure cracked. Ha, you really haven't changed at all. You said you read my diary. Did you actually finish it? If you did, how could you still say something like this? Marcus, you don't have a heart. Don't ever come looking for me again. This is the end. This time Grace didn't hesitate. She turned and left without looking back, just as resolute as she'd been when she asked for a divorce. That reminded me, there was always something I couldn't figure out. She'd forgiven me for not attending Henry's funeral. Why then would she insist on divorce over something so trivial later on? Could there have been more to it? Had I wrongly accused her? Her words kept echoing in my head, and I couldn't stop myself from wanting answers. So I rushed home and searched for that diary. Sure enough, when I flipped to the final page, I found the truth. I still remember that day. I was in the middle of a meeting at work. Suddenly, Victoria called, saying Grace had asked to meet her. She was scared and wanted me to check on the situation. I had a terrible feeling about it. Grace had been on edge lately, and Victoria was always so cautious. Victoria was so delicate. Who knew what Grace might do to retaliate? When I arrived, I saw Grace push Victoria into the water with my own eyes. To me, Grace had always been gentle. I never expected jealousy to turn her into someone so frightening. Victoria, by contrast, was everything Grace wasn't, kind and selfless. Even as I pulled her out of the water, her whole body trembling, she still spoke up for Grace. I'm fine. Don't blame her. I'm really okay. She pushed me because of a misunderstanding. It's my fault. Really, I'm fine. I looked at Grace, expecting an explanation. But all I saw was her glaring at Victoria, spitting venomous words. Shut up. Stop lying. Don't you have any shame at all? Her brazenness was infuriating. Without thinking, I slapped her. Enough. Don't you think you've gone too far? Grace, I'm so disappointed in you. You're going to apologize to Victoria today. I didn't hit her hard, but Grace stumbled, clutching her stomach, her face twisted in pain. Even then, her expression was unyielding. I'm not apologizing. I didn't do anything wrong. Do you even know what she's done? Why can't you ever see it? Why are you always blind and deaf to everything? Just once, could you stand by my side? She looked at me then, her eyes filled with desperation and a flicker of hope. Looking back now, she must have been pleading for me to uncover the truth. But I was too blinded by anger to listen. Instead, I hurled the cruelest words at her. Victoria is so pure and kind. How could she possibly be as malicious as you? Grace, why do you always have to act like such a drama queen? I just slapped you once, so why are you clutching your stomach and pretending? Even Victoria, after being pushed into the water by you, still pleaded on your behalf. Don't you feel ashamed? Grace collapsed on the floor, gasping for air as though my words had utterly drained her. But when she raised her head again, her expression was chillingly calm. No shouting, no crying. She propped herself up, her gaze drifting first to me and then to Victoria. Then, with a voice devoid of emotion, she said something that struck me like a thunderclap. Let's get a divorce. I give up. I didn't understand why she used the word give up. I thought she was lying again, trying to deceive me. After all, she loved me too much to ever leave. When Victoria left me all those years ago, Grace had stayed by my side for 3 straight days and nights, afraid I might collapse. When I was diagnosed with depression, she went out of her way to learn psychology to help me, even though she ended up battling depression herself for a long time. She gave up her career for me. She gave up her freedom for me. She couldn't live without me. I was certain of it. So at that moment, I dismissed her words entirely. Instead, I scoffed with disdain. Divorce? Fine, let's divorce. Who's afraid of who? Don't think you can threaten me. Let me make one thing clear. After the divorce, Tommy stays with me. Don't even dream of taking him away. Grace, if you apologize now, it's not too late. Grace took a deep breath, her eyes red and swollen. It was as if she had made some monumental decision. She left only one sentence behind. I don't want anything. I'll leave with nothing. Then she turned and walked away. At that moment, I thought I saw streaks of blood between her legs. Was she hurt? I wondered, perhaps I really was about to lose her this time. But my pride as a man wouldn't allow me to stop her, especially with Victoria still there. So I said nothing, just watched as she limped away. The next day we finalized the divorce. From that moment on, Grace never came back. As she promised, she left with nothing. Later I found her journal. In it she had written, Victoria confronted me today. She said I must divorce Marcus. It turns out that car accident was her doing. The day I had a fever, she deliberately kept Marcus away from me. Even on the day my father was gravely ill, she wouldn't stop. She wanted to prove Marcus only loves her, to force me to leave on my own. But I was already pregnant. I couldn't let anyone destroy my family. Reading those words, a chill ran through me. All along I had thought Grace was just being petty, always making trouble out of nothing. I never realized how much I had hurt her because of Victoria. Again and again. That day too, it was Victoria who provoked her first. Grace had only retaliated by pushing her. My hands trembled as I continued flipping through the pages. Marcus, why don't you ever believe me? Why couldn't you even spare our child? I'm so tired, so very tired. Let's just end it. Child? So that's why Grace was clutching her stomach that day. She was pregnant. And yet, I not only hit her but also sided with Victoria. How much pain and heartbreak must she have endured? I thought back to her expression that day, her resolute demeanor. Tears began streaming uncontrollably down my face. I hated myself. I hated myself so much. Why couldn't I have treated her better? I slapped myself hard, as if trying to jolt my foolish past self awake. Perhaps fate had led me to her journal to remind me to cherish what I had lost. I frantically dialed Grace's number. I was wrong. I was so wrong. This time I truly understand how wrong I was. I won't pressure you to donate bone marrow anymore. Can we start over? We can still have another child. But Grace remained silent for a long time. Finally, she said just one thing before hanging up. There's no going back. I used to think Victoria was the love of my life. Even after divorcing Grace, I pretended not to care, trying to numb myself. But the truth is, it wasn't until that moment that I realized I had already fallen in love with Grace. At the hospital, Victoria was still lying in bed, waiting for a bone marrow transplant. She held my hand, feigning frailty as always. Grace refused to donate, didn't she? It's okay, Marcus. It's really okay. I don't blame her. Maybe I'm just destined to suffer. Destined to be pushed into the water by her. Looking at her pale face, I felt no pity, only an overwhelming disgust. Once she had been my unattainable dream, my flawless Victoria. But in reality, 10 years ago, she had left me for another man. I had always known this deep down, yet my possessiveness wouldn't let go. Because I never truly had her. I kept her close in this ambiguous, toxic entanglement. I was a terrible man through and through. Yet Grace had tolerated me, forgiven me, until she finally gave up. What had I done all these years? What had I become? I couldn't help but shake off Victoria's hand as the thought crossed my mind. Victoria, aren't you tired of pretending all this time? I know everything now. Over these years, you've only brought me disappointment. I won't go to Grace anymore, and I certainly won't let her donate her bone marrow to you. Victoria froze, her eyes instantly reddening at my outburst. I didn't. Please believe me, Marcus. Did Grace say something to you? But I really didn't. Looking at Victoria's pitiful act, for a moment I almost believed her. But then I took out the voice recorder and played back her words from that day, unaltered and unmistakable. She stopped her act entirely as her struggles ceased. Yes, that recorder had been tucked into the last page of the folder, recording everything she had said that day. Her provocations and sneers directed at Grace were all laid bare. I realized then that Grace must have preserved this evidence in the beginning, hoping that I would wake up to the truth. But from the moment I struck her with my own hand, causing her to miscarry, she had stopped caring. She no longer cared about me, Tommy, or the family we once had. That was why she hadn't defended herself. To her, the truth no longer mattered. But at least in the end, I finally saw Victoria for who she truly was. The next day, I went with Victoria to finalize our divorce. Knowing she was guilty and cornered, she didn't argue much. I thought that would be the end of it. Seeing how miserable she was now, I had no intention of pursuing the matter further. But I hadn't anticipated Tommy's reaction, crying and throwing tantrums, insisting on staying with Victoria. I was furious and decided not to coddle him anymore. One day, he'd see for himself who truly cared for him. What I didn't foresee was how far Victoria would go. She manipulated Tommy, urging him to threaten Grace with suicide to force her into donating her bone marrow. Even though Grace was visibly reluctant, she still came. I rushed to the hospital as well. Grabbing Grace's hand, I tried to stop her. "You don't have to do this," I pleaded. But Grace simply let out a cold, bitter laugh and yanked her hand away. "Stop pretending to be the good guy. Isn't this exactly what you wanted? I'm here to save the woman you cherish. You must be thrilled, aren't you?" I opened my mouth to refute her, but no words came out. So this is what it feels like to be misunderstood. Tommy, holding a small knife to his wrist, kept pressuring Grace. "You evil woman. Go get the match test done. Save my Victoria, Mom. Hurry." Grace looked at Tommy, her face filled with pain and disbelief. "Marcus, is this what you've taught your son?" I felt a deep sense of guilt, unable to meet her gaze. I wanted to tell her that Victoria and I were already divorced and that this had nothing to do with me. But did it even matter anymore? Nothing mattered now. The test results came back quickly. Grace's bone marrow was indeed a match for Victoria. But the bad news was that she couldn't undergo the transplant. She had severe kidney failure and was in urgent need of a transplant herself. Without one, her days were numbered. No wonder she had refused the procedure before. I had assumed she was lying. I had doubted her over and over again. No wonder she hated me now. I deserved this. When the doctor announced that the transplant couldn't proceed, Tommy flew into a rage, waving the knife wildly. "I don't care. I don't care. I just want Victoria, Mom, to get better." Let this wretched woman die. If she dies, Victoria Mom can live, right? Hearing Tommy's words with my own ears, Grace's expression grew complicated. She crouched down to face him directly. Do you really hate me that much? Hate me enough to wish I were dead? Tommy pointed the knife at her, his face filled with disgust. Yes. Victoria Mom lets me eat snacks, play on the phone, and says I don't have to study. I love Victoria Mom the most. I hate you, you evil woman. Grace gave a faint, bitter smile and turned away. All right, fine. Then you'll never have to see this evil woman again. I knew then, just as she had given up on me before, she was giving up on Tommy now. Watching my son's disgraceful behavior, I couldn't hold back and struck him in frustration. Then I hurried after Grace. Why didn't you tell me about your health? Why didn't you let me know? Maybe I could have helped you. We could have faced it together. Grace turned back to look at me with a composed but mocking gaze. What good would that have done? I told you so many things before. Did you ever believe me? And what have you ever done for me? I opened my mouth, but once again I was at a loss for words. All this time Grace had been the one giving everything for this family, not me. I truly hadn't done anything for her. Grace limped away, her steps uneven, without looking back. Marcus, if you really feel sorry for me, then let me go. I just want to live peacefully on my own. In that moment, my heart felt as though it had been torn apart. But I also understood I had lost any right to ask for forgiveness. Not long after, Victoria's illness worsened again, and she finally revealed her true colors. She actually tied Tommy up, trying to force him to donate bone marrow to her. Fortunately, the doctors intervened in time to stop Victoria's deranged behavior, and Tommy was rescued. The ordeal left Tommy shaken, and he came back to me. He said he missed his mother and that she would never bear to see him hurt. But it was already too late. Grace hated me and she hated Tommy too. She would never return to us. To ease the guilt weighing on my heart, I did one final thing for Grace. I donated one of my kidneys to her. I knew deep down that if she found out it was from me, she would never accept it. So I made sure to emphasize to the doctors that my identity as the donor must remain a secret. The surgery went smoothly. After recovering her health, Grace began a new chapter in her life. She found a kind and honest man, not particularly handsome, not wealthy either. But he had a way of making her laugh, bringing her genuine joy. And I silently watched her from afar, even though it pained me inside. But seeing Grace's career flourish and her marriage filled with happiness, I felt at peace. As for Victoria, she never found a bone marrow donor in time and ultimately passed away in the hospital. Out of a sense of humanity, I arranged a simple funeral for her. I think I will never forgive her, just as I will never truly forgive myself. Later, I began a quiet and unremarkable life with Tommy. Sometimes regret would creep in, and I'd wonder why I didn't cherish the best person I ever had when I had the chance. But life, after all, has to keep moving forward.